If you are someone who values critical thinking at all, you have probably noticed that the quality of mainstream media and journalism over time has fallen into a massive black hole of failure. The general news we see on TV sucks, and everyone knows it, with partisan reporting in a tabloid style becoming more so the norm with each passing year, and you may have also noticed how great the evidence is that much of this establishment media doesn't exactly care about truth. There are hundreds of videos and articles out there already, detailing evidence of how much of what Americans see on typical cable TV media is dishonest, and how they largely operate by combining lies of omission, selective reporting, and intentional logical fallacies, all in order to push narratives that are completely false. And while most of these videos do a good job explaining how media bias works, I have noticed that a lot of them do not go into great detail on the subject of why things are this way. Or in other words, just what is happening under the hood that really explains the motive behind why the mainstream media seems to no longer really care about reality. So this video will be going over one of the biggest of these under the hood causes, known as state media proxies. A state media proxy is any news media organization that is technically a member of the private sector, but in practice acts as a state media organization, which, as the name suggests, is news run by the state for pushing political propaganda and biased narratives in favor of the political party they represent. For example, China Central Television, which is an official state media organization for the Chinese Communist Party through China Media Group. Throughout its existence, China Central TV has brought us many delightful gems of knowledge, such as denial of the Uyghur genocide, defamation and repression of the Falun Gong spiritual practitioners, painting people the CCP doesn't like as guilty of crimes they did not commit before they even get to trial, and of course the claim that COVID originated from the USA, and many citizens of China unironically still believe this misinfo about the pandemic to this day. And all of this is just a small drop in the bucket of diarrhea that is the Chinese Communist Party propaganda they air through China Central. Just about no one outside of China takes this obvious trash seriously. But what about the West? Well, let's take a look at CNN. On paper, CNN is a private news media organization under Warner Media, which is under the parent company AT&T. CNN is supposedly not a state media organization, at least on paper, so what gems of knowledge has CNN provided for us? Well, first there was a claim that it's illegal to look through WikiLeaks and that they would be providing WikiLeaks details in full disclosure, only for them to then go over less than 1% of them. Faking interviews when they can't find enough regular people who agree with their predetermined political narrative. Colluding with the Clinton campaign to push DNC propaganda with endless Orange Man bad stories. Misinformation about how easy it is to purchase an automatic rifle, and general bias so strong that even fact-checkers with similar bias admit that CNN is biased. So, what the heck happened? Why is it that CNN pushes garbage in favor of the DNC in a similar fashion as China Central shills for the Chinese Communist Party? Well, when you look at some of the details of their owners' finances and relationships with Washington, it quickly becomes quite obvious. As mentioned, AT&T is their parent company after going through Warner. AT&T is one of the top 20 spenders overall in terms of lobbying, having pushed hundreds of millions of dollars through Washington since 1990, with the majority of contributions going towards Democrats. But what's really odd is when you look at their invested members, meaning the politicians that have a stake in the other direction. You will notice that Nancy Pelosi is ranked at the top, along with a bunch of other establishment stooges. And don't forget the revolving door, with multiple people having worked for or currently employed as a lobbyist for AT&T also having served as members of the federal government. Over 70% of AT&T's lobbyists in recent years have held government jobs in the past. And if you go to the Revolving Door Project's website, they have an interactive graph that actually shows how many of these government agencies are aligned with certain sectors of the economy. And it's pretty much everywhere. If you need further evidence, though, just look at WikiLeaks and search DNC email dumps for CNN. If this was a regular relationship, there would be emails of DNC members expressing worry about what the press will think of certain things they have done and how to deal with CNN's supposed alleged journalistic investigation. But instead, you see boring nonsense like video requests or information about interviews and questions, of course, before the interview has taken place. And while I admittedly didn't read all the thousands of emails leaked that mentioned CNN, in the couple hundred I did go through, I certainly did not see anything that would suggest that the DNC is concerned in any way that CNN might give them the slightest hint of opposition to their goals. And it's also very important to point out that none of this information is a conspiracy theory. This is all publicly available and verified data. The news just rarely talks about it for obvious reasons. So what does it all mean? Well, it means that AT&T has a vested interest in maintaining the corporatist oligarchical status quo where government and large corporations effectively act as one and serve each other towards a common goal while passing legislation that limits their competition. And while the GOP is certainly not innocent here, the party that most regularly pushes for government bureaucracy and increased relationships is generally the Democratic Party, which explains why this is where most of AT&T's campaign money goes towards supporting. From this, we can start to finally come back down to CNN and see a major conflict of interest. CNN has a much greater financial incentive to push a biased narrative that shills for the DNC than they have an incentive to actually tell people the truth. So it makes perfect sense that their narrative isn't based on what's actually going on in the world, but rather based on the interest groups that they represent. So while they may not technically and officially be a state media organization, the relationship they have with the current ruling political party and Washington elite establishment is so absurdly intertwined that they might as well be. This, in essence, is what a state media proxy is. Privately operated media in name and official status, but state-operated media in its execution and function. So when you take a second look at CNN, knowing they are just a state media proxy representing the DNC, suddenly all their nonsensical reporting mentioned earlier makes perfect sense now. Of course, CNN doesn't want you looking at WikiLeaks because it would reveal how much they are just a bunch of paid carnival shills. Of course, they would fake interviews in order to make their narrative look like a legitimate view held by real people. Of course, they would collude with the DNC to ensure their candidate is painted in a positive light, since that's where their financial allegiance lies. And of course, they would spread disinfo about purchasing firearms, since gun restrictions is a DNC political talking point. And of course, they get rated as left biased because they represent the DNC. But here's the kicker. CNN is just one example of many. In the last 40 years or so, the number of companies controlling the majority of US media has diminished from 50 to 6. And all 6 of them are heavily engaged in a financial and revolving door relationship with the US government. This is why most cable TV and other establishment news we see today, well, sucks. They don't provide a service to the public by keeping us informed, rather they pretend to be impartial while acting as propaganda for the state. And I'm just using CNN here as a simple example due to how obviously trash they are. The only thing really special about CNN in this regard is that they just do one of the worst jobs at hiding the fact that they are all paid shills. But the harsh truth is that just about every news program you will find if you watch basic cable TV in the United States is in fact a state media proxy. Just take a look at the revolving door for other big media corporations: Comcast, National Amusements, News Corp, Sony, and of course Disney. All of these major media conglomerates have a higher percentage of lobbyists who used to work for the federal government in some capacity than not. For example, the owners of MSNBC, Comcast numbers are actually worse in most regards than AT&T and CNN, with 85% of their lobbyists having held government jobs. Oh, and Pelosi is their top investor too. What a coincidence. This unfortunately is a common thing with big media. Work for the federal government, then go work for the media, then maybe go back to work for the government some more, then maybe work for the media again. This explains why the news organizations under the umbrella of these holding companies so often pushes similar narratives and propaganda. It's not because the narrative is true, but because they all have the same vested interest in shilling for the state. It also explains why organizations and movements that call out this corruption are often heavily slandered by the bulk of US media. Julian Assange is bad and WikiLeaks are Russian assets. Source: US state media proxies. Project Veritas is some kind of far-right disinfo mill. Source: US state media proxies. Gamergate was some kind of mass harassment campaign. Please pay no attention to the media collusion they uncovered. Source: US media proxies. It's just a simple reality. If you call these people out on what they are doing in any meaningful capacity, and your call out gains enough traction, dishonest slander and false accusations being flooding in your direction is not a question of if, but a question of when. Corrupt state media proxies will engage in dishonest spin doctoring of the facts in order to paint their critics in a negative light, in order to discredit them in the eyes of those who would rather remain asleep. WikiLeaks is especially a litmus test on this. If you want to know for sure that a news organization is nothing more than a bunch of paid grifters and state shills, look no further than pathetic attempts to discredit WikiLeaks via garbage tier opinion articles. And these opinion hit pieces will often come from multiple sources, since multiple sources fall under this umbrella of the state media proxy establishment, an umbrella that is much larger than most people seem to realize. For instance, even media organizations that fall outside the realm of the Big Six aren't always innocent either. For instance, Fox Media's president, Marty Moe, used to work for the Clinton administration administration, specifically under Clinton's Secretary of Treasury. There is also the fact that the Washington Post is actually owned by Jeff Bezos, and Amazon's finances in regards to their interests in Washington are also quite questionable. The point here is Congress's web of connections is absolutely massive, and the bulk of US media we see on the news and consume is a huge part of that web of connections. This is why so much of the media is biased and why they lie to you. To put it very simply, they lie to protect their interests within the state, and those interests simply do not align with truth. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm currently working on my next BreadTuber episode, which involves watching content that I would rather not.
On the left, we don't really tell people what to do. We tell them what not to do. Don't exploit the workers.
But it has to be done, so if you're interested in seeing that, feel free to like and subscribe. Till next time.